That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Well, hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Only Human with Dr. Tonykern podcast, where we plan to take to task the questions about what it means to be human in a world that grows increasingly inhuman. Systems of systems, social media, artificial intelligence, and a dizzying, accelerating pace of change have all disrupted the sense of individuality and purpose that we once had. And we're going to be here to unpack it all. Now, each episode will have a central theme. Today, the theme is heroes. And we're going to try to take a look backwards through the lens of history, kind of pull it into the present, and project into an unknowable future. We hope that this may ignite some new ideas, new directions, new possibilities of what it means to be only human. As your humble host, I feel it's only right I expose my bias here, and here's what it is. I think the words "only human" are the ultimate oxymoron. I mean, think about it. We've been to the moon and back multiple times. I think 6, right? Multiple times, even before computers really existed. Right? We cured diseases. We split the atom. We're starting to tinker around with quantum physics. And there's something, I mean, we're not going to go deep into that, but I promise you, if quantum physics doesn't deeply disturb you, you don't understand it well enough. It's just weird, sci-fi weird. But in today's podcast, we're going to look at what it means to be a hero. And we're going to look at it through the lens of fame and fortune, contribution, and readiness to arrive at, hopefully, a new understanding of how to either become a hero, recognize the right heroes for yourself and others around you, and maybe even be ready to become one someday, in the truest sense of the word, no matter what your station in life. So let me begin with a definition or two of hero. In the Greek tradition, a hero was a human, male or female, of the remote past, right? Who was endowed with superhuman abilities. And mostly in Greek literature, it was because they were demigods, which were half human and descended from an immortal god somewhere. So if you think of names that you might recognize, things like Achilles, Odysseus, Aphrodite, Hercules. Despite their mortality, heroes, almost like the gods that they were descended from, became kind of objects of cult worship. We're going to come back to that, right? Because heroes are put on a pedestal. And who we put on our pedestals matters to us and matters deeply. But we'll come back to that. More recently, definitions like out of the Oxford English Dictionary 1900 vintage had a couple of them. I got to read these here. A man of distinguished courage or ability, admired for his brave deeds and noble qualities, right? Back before we couldn't say things like that. But it had a second definition too. It was a person who, in the opinion of others, has heroic qualities or has performed a heroic act and therefore is regarded as a model or an ideal. All right, so that puzzled me a little bit, and it leads me to the first question for today. I want to ask you, can somebody be a hero if no one knows what they did to earn the title? Right? Does being a hero really require the admiration of others? Let's throw out a few examples. Let's think of you're driving down a country road and you see a turtle in the middle of the road. You stop your car, you get out, you look both ways, you go up and you pick the turtle up, put him in the other ditch so he doesn't get crushed by the next car. Is that person a hero? And you could say, well, maybe to the turtle. Of course, turtles don't have the ability to think that way, so probably not even to the turtle. But to us, is that person a hero? Or let's think of it, maybe a nurse's aide, right? Who sees a sleeping patient who's obviously lying uncomfortably. And they walk by, and it's not in their job description, but they say, you know what, man, I can do something to help this person. They go in, they gently lift their head up, fluff the pillow, and lay their head back down. Not in their job description. Maybe they do it routinely. Are they heroes? Or, you know, the classic story of the popular high school kid who sits by the new geeky kid at school at lunch and begins a conversation because everybody else is shunning them. Are they heroes? See, being a hero sometimes in modern society seems to indicate you've got to have some great thing that you did that the public recognized. Think of Captain Sully in Miracle on the Hudson, or you know, maybe one of the giants of industry or business. But as we think back into those examples I gave you, you know, the turtle, the nurse's aide, and this popular high school kid sitting with a geeky kid in the lunchroom. And I think most of us would say, we're kind of thinking, yeah, that there's some heroism involved in that. And that brings us to the modern day. It's a simple act of empathy or caring in a world where it's not my problem or it's not my job. Has that become an act of heroism? So heroism in a weird way is relevant to the times we live in. And I'll ask again, does it matter if no one sees it? And no one will ever know, right? So perhaps these aren't heroic acts, but there's one thing I can absolutely assure you. These people are preparing to become heroes. As they build a habit of caring in little ways, and more importantly, acting upon that empathy, that caring, they're far less likely to become one of those timid bastards who stand around recording a heinous act on their cell phone when they could be stepping in to help somebody. So when the big moment comes that requires action, these little heroes, if you want to think of them that way, will step forward because that's who they are. Or perhaps, better said, that's who they have intentionally become by making the small choices to step up in daily life. So, you know, one of the things I always think is cheesy is when somebody who's doing a podcast or up on a stage talking to a bunch of people tries to promote their book. So I'm going to tell you right now that I'm feeling a little cheesy about this, but in my upcoming book called The Armored Knight and Infinite Battle, I point out that building the habit of doing more than's necessary to help somebody else out in a small way is a hugely powerful behavioral strength builder. Okay? And it ripples out into the world in many different ways. A lot of them we won't ever know about. Right? But more importantly, it ripples into our neural pathways and into our character. When helping others becomes a habit, it becomes more difficult for us not to rise to the occasion. Once the need's recognized, we move to action without having to make a complicated decision about it. In a word, we become naturally heroic. So I want to pull forward now and look at this idea of who are our heroes from today's perspective, where social media may have redefined what character even is and what it means to be admired by others, right? Is it number of likes or the number of followers, right? Or where fame and fortune are more important than actual contribution. So let's think of our reality TV stars, shall we? To start up with, I have never watched an episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians or Jersey Shore, but I sure see a lot of it in social media. But those programs have brought fortune and fame and adoration to their stars, right? Many of whom are seen as modern day heroes by virtue of the number of followers and like and influence they have, right? A lot of these personalities have massive followings and they wield significant influence, especially over our young and impressionable. But not just that. But to many young people, being the next I don't know, I'll probably get this wrong, Snooki or Chloe is their dream. But it's not just the young that are succumbing to this. So then we have our controversial entrepreneurs, right? Some business figures have become perceived as heroes, sometimes temporarily, because they've achieved an enormous financial success. But the ethical practices sometimes leave a little bit to be desired. A couple of examples. Think of Elizabeth Holmes. I don't know if you remember her. She had the supposed technology to take a single drop of blood and run all these tests on it and make all these other medical tests obsolete. Became almost an overnight billionaire. There's I think an HBO series, might be Netflix, could be any of those, called The Dropout. And it's all about Elizabeth Holmes. Of course, she's in prison now. Or Sam Bankman-Fried, SBF, right? Both of these people grace the covers of magazines and were heroes for the next generation of rule-breaking entrepreneurs. Of course, it was all built on fraud, right? But there's still a lot of people out there that believe the only real sin they committed was getting caught, right? They got theirs. So with that kind of running in the background, let's look at a couple examples maybe of what I consider to be, at least in my mind, authentic heroism. The first, I mentioned Captain Sullenberger, Miracle on the Hudson, caught on camera, really terrific act of airmanship and leadership, rightfully deserving the title of hero. But he's not the only pilot out there that acts that way. And so I want to tell you about another one you may not have heard about. This is about United Airlines Flight 1175, captained by one Christopher Benham. Christopher Benham is fascinating, not only because he had a catastrophic engine disintegration in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about 2/3 of the way from San Francisco to Honolulu, and recovered an aircraft that was probably, by most opinions, unrecoverable, right? Descended through the clouds, made a landing. I could go into all the details, but he's got an upcoming book coming up too called, I think it's Date with Destiny, The Untold Story of United Flight 1175. But when you look at Chris Benham, what you find is his entire life was preparation for that moment, right? Born in Iran, dad was a political prisoner. He had to flee Iran from England to the United States, didn't speak English, but had a dream of flying, right? So he comes up through primary, secondary schools, obviously masters English, does very, very well in school, and goes on to achieve his dream of becoming a pilot, and then works his way up to become not only a pilot, but United Airlines captain of the Boeing 777. Right? Also along the way, he picks up a lot of different habits. He becomes a very accomplished sailor. And he talks about sailing a boat like flying an airplane because of the balance. And speaking of balance, he also becomes one of these people that stack rocks and can do these funny formations because they keep their center of gravity and balance perfectly in line. And he talks about that in his narrative about how that whole concept of balance came into play. Also, an accomplished martial artist, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, when the moment came that he had to perform all of those little things, the hardships that he had already overcome, the hobbies that he had been practicing his entire life, all manifest itself in about 45 minutes of heroism, right? So a great story about what I consider to be an authentic hero. But there's some other ones we hear about every so often that make the news. And this one's one of my favorites. It's a military story. It's a story of Salvador Gunta. I probably messed up that name. The Subway sandwich artist from Iowa. I had the pleasure and honor of meeting this guy who was Sergeant Gunta at the Air Force Academy, where they had all of the existing Medal of Honor winners come and talk at a character and leadership symposium in Colorado Springs. And Salvador Gunta was a Medal of Honor winner. You're going to hear this story in just a second. He took the stage to talk to 4,000 cadets, and he was very nervous, young man. And he said, you know, you're going to be leaders. I was just a soldier. Make sure you take care of your soldiers and be good at what you do and study hard and all that stuff. And he finished, and it was like, well, what about your Medal of Honor, right? He didn't talk at all about it. And so he says, okay, I'm now open for questions. And the first cadet came up and grabbed the microphone and he said, yeah, what flipped the switch, man, in you? How did you go from being, you know, you into turn into Rambo, right? Which was the story everybody wanted to hear. They wanted to really know that. And Salvador had a really fantastic response to that. And one I've just thought about so many times since then. He said, I'm really glad this is a military audience because you're going to understand this better than a lot of the civilian people I talk to. What happened when I was ambushed, they were on patrol in Afghanistan, and it was nighttime, and they got ambushed by well over a dozen heavily armored people that had set a trap for him. And his little group was about 5 or 6 people, right? And that scenario is called a near ambush, right? And what Gunta said to the cadets was that, I'm glad you asked me what happened because nothing happened. And then he's silent for a second. And he said, I had been in near ambushes, I don't know, dozens of times before, but it was always in training. And there were always safety observers and people were shooting blanks. And if you didn't do it right, they'd come up and tap you on the shoulder and say, lay down, you're dead. This is exactly the same, except there weren't any safety observers and they weren't shooting blanks. Now, think about that for a minute. What he was telling us is, you know, you take your training seriously. You train as you fight like you train, or your daily habits form your readiness to become a hero at some point in time. And the story gets even better. And I won't tell you the whole story except to say he finished his presentation by saying, you know, I'm embarrassed by this Medal of Honor because I'm an average soldier, not the best even of those 5 guys that were there. And just so you know what he did is he did what you're supposed to do, and that is you run toward the fire. And he took the fight to the enemy, even though it was likely to result in death. He saw one of his injured people being dragged away. He chased them, kept firing, and finally the enemy broke and ran, and he hauled that guy back to safety, temporary safety. And for that, he's awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, which he felt so bad about, he flew to his old unit and gave it away and doesn't wear it anymore because he just didn't feel like what he had done was any different than what anyone would have done. Now, we probably all have our opinions on that, whether or not in the same sort of situation or any similar situation, we would have that kind of courage, right? But these are the role models. To me, these are the real heroes. I got one even better, and it might be our last hero story before we kind of get to some takeaways. There's a guy named Bill Crawford. Bill Crawford was a janitor at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Really quiet guy, kept to himself. This was back in the late 70s and early 80s. He'd stroll around the squadron, cleaning up the latrines, picking up litter after 100 young cadets, right? Generally waving to them, saying hello if they said hello first. Little did these guys know who he really was, walking around cleaning up their trash. To cut to the chase, Mr. Crawford was also a Medal of Honor winner from World War II, where in a really high-intensity infantry battle in Italy, he had, and now I'm going to read from the citation, in the face of intense and overwhelming hostile fire with no regard for his personal safety, on his own initiative, Private Crawford single-handedly attacked multiple heavy fortified enemy positions and caused an overwhelming enemy force to flee, saving hundreds of American soldiers. Okay. the power of two young men, really, with bold initiative at the moment of greatest need, and they survived, be recognized for it. The interesting story about Crawford is they didn't think he survived, right? They couldn't find him, and so everybody said, that crazy guy that won the battle for us, man, he must be dead. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, right, after he died. When in fact, he'd been taken captive by the Germans, and upon his release, he gets told, hey man, did you know you're a Medal of Honor winner, right? And he said, well, that's fantastic, but there was never any ceremony, and he decided to keep it to himself. He spends 20 more years in the Army, he retires, and decides to move back to Colorado, and took the job as a janitor to make ends meet. Right? Now here's where the story gets really interesting. So is this guy a hero if nobody knows? Right? I mean, his colleagues knew, but being that he works there in cadet land at the Air Force Academy, and there's military history courses and all that other stuff, one of the cadets was doing some research for his military history paper on the battles that occurred in Italy, and he came across this story and a picture of Private Crawford. And after discussing it with his buddies, they took the book and the picture and they asked him about it. And at first he kind of was like, yeah, I don't really talk about those days. That was a long time ago. But finally they pressed him and he goes, yep, that's me. Closed the book and handed it back to him. So word gets around, right? And from then on, let's just say the cadets kept a lot cleaner squadron than they used to when he had to pick up their trash. He was recognized for what he was, which was humble and heroic, right? Two things that seem to go together if you begin to detach them from social media and reality stars and crooked entrepreneurs. Without ever expecting anything, after talking to these cadets for a while, they were chit-chatting one afternoon, and he said, yeah, the only real regret I have, I probably didn't deserve this medal, but having gotten it, it would have been nice to get it from the president like everybody else, right? So you know what's coming, right? In 1984, President Ronald Reagan was the commencement speaker at the Air Force Academy. And the cadet squadron where he worked invited him to attend, kept everything a secret, and said, hey, if it's possible, can you wear your old uniform if you still have it? Which he did, pressed in his closet, still fitting, right? So President Reagan takes the stage, and his remarks were all focused on the lessons from this humble guy, right? And at the end of his graduation speech, called him to the stage where he was presented with a Medal of Honor. How cool, right? And President Reagan made the following statement. He says, obviously anyone can become a hero. Mr. Crawford didn't meet the traditional description in any way, except for the actions he made on that day. Is there any job beneath your dignity that you can't do well if a former Medal of Honor winner like Bill Crawford can clean latrines and smile? Right? In an interview right after the ceremony, he said almost exactly what a lot of these heroes say. What Captain Sullenberger said, what Captain Brennan of United 1175 said, right? What Salvador Gunte said. He said, I was just doing my part. I figured it was just a normal call to duty, but the challenge was really big right then, and I had to step forward. I just was in the right place at the right time. Now, can you imagine that? People saying I'm in the right place at the right time when they're facing certain death, or an engine has exploded, or they just sucked a bunch of geese in their airplane, the engines don't fly anymore, and they have to land it on the Hudson River? Okay. I think there's an old quote out of the book of Esther, right? And it says, for such a time as this. Okay. So, yes, he did happen to be in the right place at the right time. All of them did. But they also took action. And that brings us to the essential takeaways and kind of the wrap-up section of this podcast. Here's my takeaways. Authentic heroes are important. They're important to us individually, and they're important to society. Inauthentic heroes, and I'm going to lump in a lot of the reality TV stars that don't use their fame for good purposes into that group, are bad for society. because they take the place of what actual heroism looks like. Point 2 is that we should choose our heroes carefully. If we tend to follow someone who's a braggart and brash and always seeking attention, we tend to become narcissistic like them. We're going to talk about narcissism in a future podcast, but that's a slippery road to character hell. The third point I'd like to make is that you don't have to have any magical set of qualifications to become a hero. We're all capable of becoming heroes if we prepare for the moment with our actions and our habits every day, whether we're in positions of authority or simply cleaning latrines with a smile. Okay? When preparation meets opportunity, heroes are made. And I want to close with the words from Winston Churchill. Okay? And I love this quote. It's on my wall here in my office. He says, maybe I should, if I'm doing Winston Churchill. Probably have a wire, you can't hear me. Okay, all right. He was better at it, he had more practice. To each there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, one uniquely fitted to them and their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour. Well, that's a wrap on the first episode of Only Human with Dr. Tony Kern, where we take to task the important issues, questions about what it means to be human in an increasingly complex and dynamic world, where it often seems like we're lost in gigantic systems and powerless. Trust me, we're neither. We are humbly and hugely powerful as individuals, and gigantic systems are made up of individuals. Big things are made of little things, right? So let me do the standard marketing thing here. I'm trying to get this podcast off the ground here. I'd love to get a fast start. My personal mission in life is to help as many as I can in as many ways as I can, in as many places as I can, for as long as I can. And this is just my newest way of trying to stay anchored to my purpose. So please link, promote, share, like, love, whatever else. Smash that love button, I don't know, to get the word out and what we're doing here together. And trust me, it's not always going to be Tony here as a soliloquy. We're going to have guests on, and we're going to have active discussions back and forth when I run out of a few things to say. But we're going to do one or two more of these. And the next one's going to be on why really good people sometimes make really bad mistakes, right? And more importantly, what we can do to avoid them. I'm going to anchor the discussion with a book by Dietrich Dorner. It's called The Logic of Failure. And what he says is that we fail spectacularly and often irrationally, but we do so in very predictable ways. And so we can use the power of our minds to figure out what those are, right? If we're willing to give ourselves a close introspective look. So with that, I'm Tony Kern, and I appreciate any and all feedback that you can give me, because after all, I too am only human. You can reach me at tonykern at convergentperformance.com or just Tony at convergentperformance.com. And I look forward to seeing you soon.